The Blackwoods of Winston County, a legacy of consanguinity. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a family whose very name still chills local residents existed, hidden among the dense forests and isolated valleys of Winston County, Alabama. The Blackwoods were known not only for their voluntary isolation from the world outside but also for the terrible genetic legacy carried through generations. This is the story of how the intertwining of family blood led to the emergence of one of the most genetically deformed lineages ever documented in American medical history during the 1950s. Discovery and initial findings. The Blackwoods case became known in April 1957 when a rural physician, Dr. James Harrington, was urgently called to a remote hill property. What he discovered would permanently alter his view of the depths of human degradation. Approximately 32 people, all belonging to the same family tree, lived on this roughly 40-acre property, distributed among 3 small wooden homes. "What I saw that day will haunt me for the rest of my life," Dr. Harrington reported in his medical records, which were later made public after his death in 1983. The scene included children with atrophied limbs, adults with distorted facial features, and a pattern of mental deficiencies recurring in nearly all the family's younger members. The Blackwood property was about 14 miles from the nearest town in Winston County, a location so remote that visitors were rare. Even mail carriers avoided the area, leaving correspondence in an improvised box by the main road. The family patriarch, Elijah Blackwood, then 67 years old, was notorious for his hostility toward strangers and the rigid control he maintained over his descendants. The Blackwoods subsisted on farming, growing corn, potatoes, and some vegetables on the rocky, fertile land. They also raised chickens and pigs, seldom traveling to town for essential supplies. The isolation was not merely geographic, it was cultural and genetic as well. This isolation had begun 3 generations earlier with the arrival of the first Blackwood to the region around 1880. Dr. Harrington was called to assist Martha Blackwood, a 16-year-old girl enduring a complicated labor. Martha was both niece and granddaughter to Elijah, the result of a union between his daughter and his brother. The baby was born with severe malformations, including polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, microcephaly, abnormally small head, and congenital heart problems, leading to its death just 48 hours after birth. This tragic event was only the starting point for uncovering an alarming case of family consanguinity that spanned at least 4 generations. Marriages between close relatives had become an unbreakable tradition among the Blackwoods, justified by Elijah as a way to safeguard the purity of the family blood and protect their lands from outsiders. The initial investigation revealed that 27 of the 32 family members exhibited some form of physical or cognitive anomaly. Common conditions included severe facial deformities, such as underdeveloped jaws and palate malformations. Reduced stature, with adults rarely exceeding 5 feet 3 inches in height. Intellectual disability, ranging from mild to severe. Vision problems, including partial or total blindness in approximately 40% of members. Congenital heart diseases. Limb malformations, such as fused or extra fingers. Dr. Harrington's notes describe William Blackwood, one of Elijah's sons, then 42, as having an asymmetrical face with widely spaced eyes, a significantly underdeveloped jaw, and an abnormal spinal curvature that made him appear much shorter than he was. His wife and first cousin, Sarah Blackwood, had coarse facial features with a flattened, widened nose, thick lips, and small, deep-set eyes. 4 of the couple's 6 children had severe intellectual disability, unable to form complete sentences even in adulthood. The most unsettling aspect, according to the doctor's reports, was the family's apparent acceptance of these conditions as normal. They don't see these deformities as a problem, but as a family characteristic, he wrote. When asked about close relative marriages, Elijah responded with disconcerting naturalness, "It has always been this way and always will be." Origins of the isolation. The story of the Blackwoods becomes darker when their origins are examined. Historical records suggest the first Blackwood, Isaiah Blackwood, arrived in the region around 1880, fleeing unexplained criminal accusations in Tennessee. Isaiah brought his wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a small son, deliberately seeking isolation in the remote Winston County mountains. A local census from 1890 already recorded the family's significant growth, with 11 members residing on the same property. However, what records do not explicitly state, but later investigations revealed, is that this growth was fueled not just by new arrivals, but by the birth of children resulting from relationships within the family itself. Letters from 1910 found on the property show rejected correspondence from distant relatives, with Isaiah's handwritten responses, "We don't need anyone. We are self-sufficient and pure. The outside world would only bring corruption to our lineage." By the third generation, around 1920, the first clear signs of the genetic impact of this practice began to appear. Local medical records, though scarce due to the family's aversion to medical care, show children being born with increasingly severe malformations. Dr. Ernest Miller, a physician who occasionally handled emergencies in the region during the 1930s, documented in his private diary, "I was called to the Blackwood property after a difficult birth. The child presented a condition I had never seen before, multiple malformations in the limbs and face, and an almost animalistic behavior from the mother, who refused to let me properly examine the newborn." The child's father, who Dr. Miller discovered was also the mother's cousin, showed similar signs of atypical facial development. The Great Depression of the 1930s only deepened the Blackwoods' isolation. While many rural Alabama families migrated to urban centers for work, the Blackwoods became even more entrenched on their property, surviving through hunting and subsistence farming. This period also marked the beginning of Elijah's leadership, who took over the family after his father's death in 1932. Under Elijah's command, the practice of consanguineous union was not just continued but actively encouraged. Local school records indicate that the few Blackwood children who briefly attended the county school in the 1940s were withdrawn after only a few months. Mrs. Dorothy Wilkins, a teacher at the time, recorded in school reports, "The Blackwood children demonstrate significant difficulties in learning and socialization. Furthermore, they present distinctive physical characteristics that make them targets of ridicule by their peers." Following complaints from Elijah Blackwood about the way his children and nephews were treated, attendance ceased. The isolation was not just a personal choice, it was also a reaction to increasing stigmatization. Local residents developed an almost superstitious fear of the Blackwoods, with exaggerated stories about their behavior and appearances circulating throughout the county. Terms like deformed creatures living in the mountains or the cursed people of the hills were often used to describe the family. In 1945, a significant event occurred when two young Blackwoods, Joseph and Daniel, half-brothers and cousins, descended to town for supplies. Their appearance caused such a commotion that frightened customers chased them out of the local grocery store. Sheriff Thomas Walsh recorded the incident. "The boys did not demonstrate aggressive behavior, just an extremely unusual appearance, eyes set very far apart, protruding jaws, and a form of communication almost incomprehensible between them. I had to escort them back to the mountains to avoid further confrontations." This event firmly solidified Elijah's resolve to keep his family completely cut off from the outside world. Between 1945 and 1957, the Blackwoods were rarely seen in town, save for Elijah and his eldest son, Robert, who occasionally purchased essential items like salt, ammunition, and tools. World War II had no direct impact on the Blackwoods. No family member served in the armed forces, partly due to their physical and intellectual conditions and partly because of their invisibility in official records. Many births and deaths within the family were never officially registered, creating a phantom population existing on the margins of American society. It was into this context of extreme isolation, social stigmatization, and generations of consanguineous marriage practices that Dr. Harrington stumbled upon the family in 1957, called to aid in Martha Blackwood's complicated birth. Medical and ethical dilemmas. Upon returning to town after his initial encounter with the Blackwoods, Dr. James Harrington faced a professional and ethical dilemma. As a doctor, he immediately recognized the classic signs of a population with a high rate of consanguinity. However, he also realized he was dealing with an extreme case that could contribute significantly to medical knowledge about the genetic consequences of these practices. After quietly consulting colleagues at the University of Alabama, Harrington secured the support of Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied similar, though less severe, cases in isolated European communities. In June 1957, 2 months after the initial incident, the two doctors returned to the Blackwood property with a carefully designed approach. "We couldn't simply arrive and announce our study intentions," Thompson later wrote in his report. We approached by offering free medical assistance and medications, knowing the family had little to no access to regular healthcare. Initially hostile, Elijah Blackwood eventually permitted the doctors to examine some family members, particularly after realizing that his granddaughter Martha was still suffering from postpartum complications that were not healing correctly. This limited opening allowed the doctors to begin what would become one of the first documented studies on the extreme effects of consanguinity in an isolated U.S. population. Over 3 subsequent visits, always under the guise of medical follow-up, the doctors managed to gather crucial data. Partial medical history of 27 family members. Anthropometric measurements of 19 individuals. Photographic documentation, with reluctant permission, of 12 members. Blood samples from 8 people for basic laboratory analyses. Due to the technological limitations of the time, the sophisticated genetic tests available today were impossible. Yet, even basic methods yielded alarming results. Blood analyses showed high levels of homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents, a clear marker of consanguinity. What we are observing in the Blackwoods, Dr. Thompson wrote in his 1957 notes, is a dramatic amplification of recessive traits that would typically remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Each generation intensified these traits, creating a cascade effect that resulted in the severe physical and cognitive manifestations we have documented. Specific conditions identified included Apert syndrome, premature fusion of skull bones, in at least 6 members. Polydactyly, extra digits, in 11 individuals. Intellectual disability, ranging from mild to profound, in approximately 70% of the family. Achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, in 8 members. Hemophilia in 3 men. Retinitis pigmentosa, progressive retinal degeneration, in almost 40% of individuals. The study also documented an alarming infant mortality rate. About 60% of babies born into the family in the last 2 generations did not survive past their first year of life. Those who did survive often developed multiple debilitating conditions throughout childhood. One of the most remarkable documented cases was that of Samuel Blackwood, 19, son of William and Sarah. The young man exhibited a rare combination of conditions: severe microcephaly, an extremely underdeveloped jaw, multiple extra fingers on both hands, vision limited to light and shadow perception, and a stature that did not exceed 4 feet 7 inches. Despite these physical limitations, Samuel showed surprising musical abilities, able to reproduce complex banjo melodies after hearing them just once. Cases like Samuel's represent the complexity of human genetics, Thompson observed. Even under conditions of extreme genetic limitation, unique and unexpected characteristics can emerge, reminding us of the unpredictability of gene expression. During one visit, Dr. Harrington managed to establish a deeper conversation with Abigail Blackwood, 52, Elijah's sister and one of the few family members who had significant outside contact in her youth. Abigail revealed she had briefly worked as a domestic servant in Huntsville, only returning when her father fell ill. "They don't know what they're doing to themselves," she confided to the doctor. "I see our children being born weaker and stranger with each generation. I tried to talk to Elijah about bringing new blood into the family, but he says the outside world will corrupt us. He doesn't realize we're withering from within." Intervention and slow transformation. In August 1957, the doctors presented their preliminary findings at a small medical conference in Birmingham, ethically protecting the family's anonymity by referring to them only as Family X from northern Alabama. The presentation sparked considerable interest in the regional medical community but also raised ethical concerns about intervention. "We are facing a population that voluntarily isolated itself and maintains practices that clearly result in physical suffering for subsequent generations," Dr. Thompson argued during the conference. "As health professionals, do we have an obligation to intervene, or should we respect their cultural autonomy even when it results in severe genetic damage?" The fall of 1957 marked a turning point. Following the medical conference, the case attracted the discreet attention of the Alabama state public health authorities. Concerned about the case's implications, the state health department dispatched a small multidisciplinary team, including a social worker, a public health nurse, and a legal representative, to assess the situation. The arrival of these authorities at the Blackwood property in October 1957 was met with open hostility. Elijah, brandishing a shotgun, initially refused them entry. Dr. Harrington's mediation, based on the minimal trust he had earned, was necessary to resolve the situation. "You have no right to interfere in how we live," Elijah shouted at the team, as later reported. "Our land, our rules. We've been here for 3 generations and nobody ever cared about us before." The public health team documented precarious living conditions in the 3 houses, no running water or electricity, rudimentary sanitation that contaminated the family's water well, and general hygiene conditions that worsened existing health problems. 5 school-age children received no formal education, and several family members had easily treatable medical conditions that had been neglected for years. Social worker Margaret Collins's official report described, "We found a family living in conditions that regress a century, both in material terms and social practices. The children show evident signs of chronic malnutrition, exacerbating the congenital conditions already present. Several adults suffer from easily treatable diseases, like severe dental infections and chronic respiratory problems, without any medical intervention." The situation presented authorities with a complex dilemma. On one hand, there were clear violations of public health and child welfare laws. On the other, a forced intervention risked traumatizing an already isolated and fragile community. After intense deliberation, the health department chose a gradual approach, prioritizing offers of immediate medical aid and education before considering more drastic measures. However, unexpected events soon accelerated the intervention process. In November 1957, a powerful storm struck the region, causing a landslide that partially destroyed one of the houses. 2 family members were seriously injured and transported to the county hospital, marking the first time many of the younger Blackwoods had left the property. This incident provided an opportunity for authorities to intervene more directly. While the injured were being treated, social workers were able to speak with other family members who had accompanied them, including 3 teenagers who showed curiosity about the outside world. Rachel Blackwood, 16, with less severe facial deformities than others but with mild intellectual disability, expressed a desire to properly learn to read. "I know I'm different," she told the social worker. "But I want to know things that are in books. Dad says we don't need that, but I dream of knowing what's written on the boxes we bring from town." This openness from some younger members, combined with the practical need for post-landslide assistance, created a breach in the family's decades-long isolation. In December 1957, an agreement was brokered. The county would provide materials to rebuild the damaged house and ongoing medical assistance in exchange for permission for the school-aged children to receive basic education from a visiting teacher 3 times a week. Elijah reluctantly agreed, primarily due to pressure from other adult family members who had glimpsed the benefits of outside contact after the landslide. This small concession marked the beginning of a slow transformation. Esther Jenkins, a 58-year-old experienced educator who had worked with isolated rural communities, began her visits in January 1958. Her personal diary offers an intimate look at this process. "My first day with the Blackwood children was a challenge unlike any other in my 30 years of teaching. 5 children between 7 and 16 years old, non-literate, all with some degree of cognitive and physical disability. But what impressed me most was their hunger for knowledge, an almost desperate hunger for information about a world denied to them. Little Timothy, 9, with his asymmetrical face and extra fingers, spent nearly an hour fascinated by a globe she brought. 'Are we really so small in the world?' he asked with wide-eyed astonishment." Throughout 1958, the consistent presence of teacher Jenkins and the occasional health professional visits began to show a noticeable impact. 3 of the children achieved basic literacy. Chronic medical conditions were treated, and gradually, Elijah's initial hostility lessened, though his distrust of the outside world persisted. A significant turning point occurred in September 1958 when Martha Blackwood, the young woman whose difficult birth had started the entire discovery process, expressed her desire to leave the property and seek treatment for her persistent health issues. Now 17 and literate thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's lessons, Martha had realized her life could be different. "I don't want anyone else in our family to suffer as we have suffered," Martha told Dr. Harrington during a consultation. "If what you say about our problems coming from marriages between relatives is true, then I need to leave here. Martha's decision to leave, accompanied by 2 teenage cousins, triggered a family crisis. Elijah initially threatened to use force to stop them, but the local sheriff's intervention and Dr. Harrington's mediation resulted in a tense agreement. The young women could leave provided they remained under social worker supervision and maintained regular family contact. This event signaled the start of the gradual breakdown of the extreme isolation that had defined the Blackwoods for generations. In the subsequent years, 1958 to 1965, over half of the younger family members chose to leave the property. Many sought medical treatment for their conditions in specialized institutions or integrated, to the extent possible, into the broader society. Dissolution and legacy. The early 1960s saw profound shifts in the Blackwoods' history. The property, an isolated enclave for nearly 80 years, slowly began to open up to the outside world. Elijah Blackwood, the uncompromising patriarch, was confronted not only with the loss of his absolute authority but also with a reality that contradicted his decades-long beliefs. In January 1962, Elijah suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and dependent on care, a situation ironically symbolic for a man who had so valued independence and isolation. Cared for by his sister Abigail and now with regular medical assistance, he lived 5 more years, passing away in 1967 at age 77. During his final years, Elijah witnessed transformations he certainly viewed as the destruction of his way of life. William, his eldest son, assumed family leadership and, influenced by the new ideas brought by educators and health professionals, began implementing significant changes on the property. The main house was renovated with social assistance funds, gaining basic plumbing and electricity in 1963. An improved access road was built the same year, allowing vehicles to reach the property even during heavy rains. The younger children began attending the local school, albeit with special support for their specific needs. Dr. Walter Thompson, who started his studies with the family in 1957, continued following the Blackwoods case for over 2 decades. In 1972, he published a seminal article in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled Multi-Generational Effects of Consanguinity in Isolated Populations, a case study from rural Alabama. The article, which maintained the family's anonymity using the pseudonym Alpha Family, meticulously documented the genetic effects observed over 5 generations. Thompson's work became a reference in population genetics, significantly contributing to the scientific understanding of the effects of prolonged inbreeding in human populations. Among Thompson's most significant documented findings were the progressively more severe expression of recessive genetic conditions with each generation, the emergence of rare combinations of conditions seldom seen in populations with greater genetic diversity, a dramatic reduction in the fertility and viability of births in recent generations, the occurrence of unexpected characteristics in some individuals, such as specific talents amidst widespread disabilities. The study also documented the improvement in general health and development of the younger family members after the 1957-58 intervention. Children who received adequate nutrition, medical care, and education showed better cognitive and physical development compared to their older cousins and siblings, proving the powerful impact of environmental factors even in cases of significant genetic predisposition. A particularly notable aspect was the follow-up of the young women who left the property in 1958. Martha Blackwood, whose difficult birth experience had initiated the entire process, eventually settled in Birmingham, where she received treatment for her medical conditions and learned basic sewing skills. Though never fully independent due to her limitations, she found purpose working in a craft program for people with disabilities. In a 1975 interview with a local newspaper, Martha, then 34, reflected, "I was born in a place where we didn't know there was another way to live. We believed we were as we should be. Now I understand that much of our suffering could have been avoided. I don't blame my parents or grandparents. They did what they believed was right. But I'm happy that our story can help other people understand the risks of this kind of isolation." Other Blackwood children and young adults who received educational and medical intervention had varied outcomes. Some with more severe disabilities were eventually placed in specialized institutions as their family caregivers aged. Others achieved surprising levels of social integration, especially those exposed to education earlier. The Blackwood property gradually depopulated. Of the 32 members living there during Dr. Harrington's first visit in 1957, only 12 remained in 1975. The land, isolated for so long, was partially sold to neighboring farmers, with a small central portion still occupied by family descendants. The Blackwoods case had wider ramifications. In the 1970s, it influenced public health policies in rural Alabama, leading to specific programs to identify and offer assistance to isolated communities. Health professionals received training to recognize signs of consanguinity and address the issue with affected communities in a culturally sensitive manner. In medical schools across the southern United States, the Blackwoods case study, always presented with pseudonyms, became part of the medical genetics curriculum, dramatically illustrating the risks of prolonged consanguinity. Dr. Thompson often commented that the story of the Blackwoods is a lesson in both genetics and humility for medicine, a reminder that entire communities can exist on the margins of healthcare systems, enduring suffering that could be mitigated with proper intervention. In 1980, a documentary team from the University of Alabama gained permission from William Blackwood, then 65 and the last of Elijah's children still alive, to create a historical and educational record of the family. The documentary, titled Isolation in the Mountains, A Story of Rural Alabama, was sensitively produced, maintaining the family's anonymity and focusing on the medical and social aspects instead of exploiting the sensationalism of the physical deformities. The film, shown only in medical and educational contexts, included interviews with professionals who worked with the family and some consenting Blackwoods members. One of the most articulate participants was Rachel Blackwood, then 39, who had become an informal advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in her community. "People look at families like ours and see only the strange, the different," she said before the cameras, her face displaying distinctive features but undeniable dignity. "They don't see the real people behind the appearances. Each of us has a story, dreams, fears. What happened to our family is a tragedy that could have been avoided with knowledge and support. I hope others can learn from our experience." The Blackwoods' genetic legacy continued, though in a diluted form, in subsequent generations. The younger members who left and formed families did so with unrelated partners, leading to a rapid decline in the incidence of severe deformities in just one generation. A follow-up study conducted by Dr. Thompson in 1985, just before his retirement, documented 43 direct descendants of the Blackwoods living across various parts of Alabama. Of these, about 30% presented mild to moderate genetic conditions, a dramatic reduction compared to the nearly 85% seen in the preceding generation. The case of the Blackwoods demonstrates both the resilience and fragility of the human genome, Thompson wrote in his final conclusions. In just one generation of genetic diversification, we observed significant improvements in the health and development of descendants. However, certain conditions persist, reminding us of the lasting impact that consanguinity practices can have across generations. The original Blackwood property, reduced to less than 10 acres, remained occupied until 1992, when the last resident, Thomas Blackwood, Elijah's great-nephew, passed away at 62. The land was sold, and the original, time-worn structures were eventually demolished. Today, few physical traces remain of the site that housed one of the most documented stories of family consanguinity in the United States. Visiting the former site of the Blackwood property is now a silent experience. The forests and mountains remain indifferent to the human drama that unfolded there for decades. A small plaque placed by local historians in 2005 marks the location with a simple inscription: "On this site lived a family whose experiences significantly contributed to the medical understanding of genetic isolation and the importance of human diversity." The last known Blackwood descendants are now dispersed, many having adopted new surnames and integrated into communities where their family history is unknown. Some maintain contact, bound by shared experiences and kinship that few outsiders could ever fully grasp. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of Dr. Harrington's initial discovery, the University of Alabama School of Medicine hosted a symposium on genetic isolation and public health, lessons learned and future challenges. Among the speakers was Michael Thompson, Dr. Walter Thompson's son and a geneticist who had inherited his father's research files. "The case of the Blackwoods is not just medical history," he stated during the event. "It's a study on how isolation, geographic, social, and genetic, can shape human destinies." It's also a story about how compassionate intervention can alter trajectories that seemed inevitable. 50 years later, we are still drawing valuable lessons from this remarkable family. Perhaps the Blackwood's most enduring legacy is educational.